Hey guys, this is a video I've been excited about making for quite some time. In this video, we'll be comparing the original 1982 Kenner Indiana Jones figures with the 2023 Hasbro Retro series figures. Now, just like Star Wars, Hasbro has gone back and made some pretty faithful recreations of the original Kenner line, and considering how tough it is to collect the Kenner line, just because Indiana Jones is not a theme that has sold particularly well historically. We'll get into that in this video. It's really cool that now for the new generation, you can get these ones for $11.99 each, or if you want to get them to complement the originals, or maybe you couldn't get Marion back then, so now you could put the new one in to kind of sub it in. Whatever the case may be, I love that they've offered these, but there's a lot to talk about here. So let's dive into the history first, and then we'll get into the comparison. The Indiana Jones toy theme did not kick off until 1982, an entire year after Raiders of the Lost Ark had come out, so the theme had lost a little bit of momentum before it could even get started. With that being said, the first wave included Indiana Jones, Marion, Toht, and the Cairo Swordsman, who is not available in the new retro wave, at least as of the time of making this video. Ceremonial Belloq was a mail-in figure where you could send in proof of purchases to get him mailed to you, but this time around he's offered on the card. The mail-in figure was not offered on card, and there are a few salesman's copies that are floating around from the 80s, but those are thousands and thousands of dollars, so it is pretty cool that we get a Belloq on a card back this time around. Now, if you compare these to an original Star Wars figure, you'll see that the Indiana Jones figures have bendable knees, whereas the Star Wars figures did not. That's because the Indiana Jones figures were based off of Butch Sundance action figures, which had posable knees, and I do think that that's pretty cool for Indiana Jones, especially because you can mount them on the Arabian horse that came out in the Series 2 of Indiana Jones figures. These figures also had a spring-loaded arm, which is kind of cool for like a quick draw theme. Not every figure got that feature, but several of them did, and it's something we'll talk about a little more in this video. And just to wrap up the history side, this is a pretty small theme as far as figures are concerned, and in Series 2, they released Indiana Jones again, Indiana Jones in a German disguise, Sala, the German mechanic who we got here in the retro wave, Belloq in his regular attire, and the Arabian horse I mentioned earlier. So now that we're back here, I do want to briefly look at the card backs, and then we'll really get into comparing the figures one-to-one and see how the new ones hold up against the old ones. So I picked up my set of these figures by visiting my local Targets. It took me several times to get the whole set, and unfortunately one thing that you'll hear a lot about is that these card backs are often damaged by the time they hit shelves. Maybe Hasbro will fix this later on, but you can see that this one is bent backwards. You can see that the German mechanic is kind of beat up here, so I just got these in case I can't find another set so that at least I can have a carded one, and then the versions that I opened for this review all had much more damaged card backs than these. So probably the most exciting one, honestly, to look at is the Belloq card back, because this one didn't actually exist back in the 80s. So it is pretty cool to see him here. You know, the only ones, like I said, are like the salesman samples, which are exceptionally rare. In fact, it's my understanding that they were thought to just be legends for a long time until they actually started popping up. So if we flip it on the back, yeah, this one's pretty damaged, but you can see it advertises these figures on the back, and it looks really cool. Love that a lot. And, you know, we have a lot of the modern stuff on here, like Hasbro, you know, recycling, notices and things like that. So it's not a one-to-one faithful recreation of the original. And the other thing to point out is on Indiana Jones, like the sticker here, I guess it's actually printed on, but it's not quite to scale with the original or anything, so I do like that it's paying homage to the original without being a literal one-to-one ripoff that you can't tell the difference. One thing that I've noticed a lot of collectors talk about too is that you can see the paper right here. I guess for legal reasons, Hasbro has to put in like disclaimers and stuff, but it does kind of ruin the vintage aesthetic, but it doesn't really bother me because honestly, I don't have the thousands and thousands of dollars to drop on the original Kenner carded ones, and I'm just as happy to put this on my display shelf compared to an original one, so I'm more than happy to have it the way it is here. For the sake of consistency, the 1982 figure will always be on the left and the Hasbro will always be on the right, just so you know how we're going into each one. With that being said, let's start off by taking a look at Toht. Of course, he's pretty much one of the main villains from the first film, and he did translate pretty well into action figure form, both on the vintage and the retro line. Now, I do think that this is one of the more faithful recreations, although you can see that there are some slight differences with the way that the jacket is molded. You can see that the new one kind of has more of like a bluish tint to it, whereas the old one is just flat black. So, you know, I think that that probably just comes to a difference in the vinyl or plastic that this was made with. So that's pretty interesting. You can see that the new one has black hair on the back, where the original has a little bit more of like a lightish brown, kind of blackish look to it. It's just slightly different hues there, but the face sculpts are very, very similar. I think that the new one has a little bit more chubbiness to the face than the original, but they are very, very close to one another. Now, the trademark thing with this figure, of course, is that you can remove the jacket, and he does have a gun in his opposite hand that's concealed inside. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I am very grateful to have an original gun, and when we see them side by side, you can see the original gun is much skinnier than the new one, but they are pretty similar overall. But the good thing is, for like repro and things like that, you'll probably never get conned out of, you know, buying like an old figure with a new gun, because they are pretty different in that respect. With that being said, as far as articulation goes, of course you could move both shoulder joints, and it is cool on this figure that they put the Staff of Ra embossed in his hand. Here, let's zoom in so you can see that. You can see that it's actually molded into his hand, which is quite cool. Then if we zoom back out, of course, he's got the same articulation here with the hips and things like that. And I guess a big reason why they did articulation like this is because if you have the horse, they could ride the horse. But, you know, it's just kind of a cool little history anecdote at this point. And of course, the articulation is the same on the new one. So pretty good, and definitely a cool figure. The German mechanic has some huge differences, namely the new one has a like spray tan look to him. I really don't like that. I hope that maybe they fix this with later waves. I would buy another one if they can get him to be a little closer to the original, but I am grateful to say I have the original wrench here too, so we can compare the wrench. That's a piece that was lost very, very easily, but I'm glad that I do have it. But other than the spray tan, it is pretty accurate to one another. Another thing to point out that I didn't point out with Toht is that the new figures do have the 2023 date on them, whereas the originals won't have a date, but they're going to say, you know, Hong Kong or whatever the case may be. So definitely worth pointing out, and I forgot to mention that on Toht. This is a figure that had a spring-loaded arm back in the day. I guess, you know, he was really going at it with the wrench here, trying to get those planes fixed and whatever, but once again, you know, you could pose the legs exactly like everybody else. This arm is not spring-loaded, it's just the right arm, and the wrench here, if we take a look at it, it does have a little pliability to it, but it's pretty solid, whereas the new one is very, very thick, and it's a little bit more rubbery, in my opinion. That being said, the figure is still pretty nice. It's just that spray tan is awful. Of course, the head turns too, but, you know, you can pose them in all the same ways. Nothing too exciting there, but hey, the German mechanic. We've got some pretty major differences between the two Belloq versions, namely the actual cloth that's on the figure. I think the original one is a lot nicer in terms of having more white spots on it, but this one is a much thicker material and definitely would hold up for play better. I think the only problem is, I don't know how many kids are buying these versus adults. I'm 27, so, you know, the original toys came out way before I was even born, but I'm not really playing with these, right? I'm just buying them and I'm going to put them on a shelf, and that's about the end of it. That being said, the articulation on both is the same. You know, you can pose the arms. He does not have one of those arms I mentioned that is spring-loaded, but you can move the legs up just like this and, you know, seat him on the horse or whatever you need to do to have your Indiana Jones adventures. Unfortunately, my Belloq is missing the neck medallion piece that the new one has, so I may buy another new one just to put the neck medallion on there. I know that it's not a one-to-one perfect recreation, but it's probably cheaper than hunting down an original, and I'm not really collecting to please anybody but myself, so I'm happy to, you know, swap out some parts and things like that. That being said, the ram's head staffs are actually pretty similar if you look at them side by side. The original is a darker color and it's a little bit thinner, whereas the new one is a lot thicker and, you know, I would be very, very careful trying to bend this. I feel like that could break very easily, whereas I'm not worried about it in the slightest with the new one. They both have a cloth belt that kind of ties around the larger robe that they're wearing, and the head molds are very, very different. I mean, they don't even look like the same person. So that's a huge difference, and then we can flip them both around, and you can see what the back looks like. Not a ton of difference there, but, you know, I do think that these are very, very different figures, and I think some people are really going to like that, and some people are going to wish it was more faithful. But drop a comment and let me know what you think. Okay, so Marion is kind of hard to review because she doesn't stand up very well on her own, so I'm going to lay the Marions down and talk about the monkey first. Now, this monkey got lost a lot very easily back in the day because it's such a small piece, so this is the retro monkey. Unfortunately, I do not have the vintage one to compare it to, but it is a very cool accessory inclusion for the character. Now, with that being said, comparing the two figures, my Marion has definitely seen better days, but this is a very, very hard to get figure. I paid, I think, $200 for this last year in 2022, and that was a pretty good deal, even with how beat up it is. This figure has just continued to go up in value, and I think the big thing here is that it is a very different figure. I think the arms and the torsos are very similar, but the heads are completely different. Like, you know, the hair is pretty similar, but the face molds and paint applications are different. And then the dress is actually very different too, because the original had the flower, you know, stitched into the back, whereas the new one does not. It's actually a completely different stitching design altogether, but definitely has that old school dollhouse feel, and just like the movie, you know, they rip her dress up so that they can light the dress for torches, so the dress actually is removable. It just kind of slides down the figure's legs like that, and then you have the look from the movie when they're in the Well of Souls, so it's definitely a very cool figure. I wish that my vintage Marion was in a little better condition, but it is what it is, and hey, I would definitely recommend getting the $12 one to fill a gap in your collection versus spending $200, $300, maybe even $400 on an original, you know, especially if you get one in the condition I have. I'm grateful to have it, don't get me wrong, but man, I really, really wish it was a better condition figure. And now we're on to the main event, Indiana Jones himself. These figures are actually very, very different, and I think that there are some things about the original that are better and some things about the new one that are better. Namely, the original colors are much, much better, and I think that the face is a lot better on the original as well. I don't know that either one necessarily has a dead ringer look for Harrison Ford, but the original one gets a lot closer than the new one in my opinion. I also really prefer the color of the fedora on the original compared to the new one, and I think that the jacket color is better too. I don't necessarily mind the shoes or legs on the new one, so I don't really care about that as much. I think that that's just kind of going to be beauty in the eye of the beholder there. You can see that we've got all kinds of printing on the back of the jacket here saying, you know, the year and where they're made and things like that, so a huge differentiator there. And as I flipped them both around, the whips fell out of both of their hands, which is a problem that unfortunately Hasbro got close to fixing, but didn't get super all the way there. You know, Indiana Jones has always had trouble holding the whip, so if you look at his left hand, you can see that it's kind of in a C shape, and the new whip, actually, let's go ahead and set the figures aside and talk about the whip. So the new whip is in my right hand, and the old whip is in my left hand. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and change the camera angle to get a little better shot of this. All right, there we go. So the old whip is the one on top. It has a much shorter handle and thinner handle, whereas the new one has a very, very thick handle, but the length of the whip is nowhere near as long as the original. I mean, if we put the handles side by side, you can see the original one is much longer. So I don't know that that's good or bad. I do think it's a little bit odd that they didn't go ahead and just make the whip brown like in the movie, but I could see people complaining about that, like, oh, the original one was black, so they both need to be black. I don't know, this kind of treads interesting water of like, you know, now that they're going back and making these figures, since they're changing some things, should they have just made them all better? I'm not really sure. I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below, but those are the whip comparisons. So once the whips are in the figure's hands, we really have to talk about how the figure holds them. The original is pretty notable for the fingers breaking off, particularly this hand's thumb, because it's just not engineered perfectly, but the new one has very, very thick hands. If you look at the hands, the new one, of course, it almost looks like he's wearing like mittens or something because the hands are so bulky. It's almost like Hasbro overcompensated for the thickness that they needed to have, but that being said, it does hold the gun much better, but it doesn't hold the whip as well. For example, if I just gently tap the whip, it falls out. Whereas with the old one, there is slightly more grip to it. Not a ton more, but, you know, we're doing a comparison video here, so we have to point it out. The other thing is, of course, both figures have a holster molded into the legs, so you could take the pistol out of Indy's hand very, very carefully so you don't break that thumb off like I was mentioning. And then the pistol goes in backwards, actually. A little something like that. Then you could flip the figure around on this side, and you could coil the whip up and have it hang on his belt. So that's pretty cool too. Then, of course, the same thing is true this time around. You could remove the pistol. The pistol goes in backwards over here. And then you can coil the whip up kind of in a circular shape, and then it'll clip right into his belt like that. The belt works just the same on both. I mean, it's kind of hard for them to improve that, so that works out pretty well, and that's going to conclude our comparison, so let's zoom out and I'll give you my final thoughts. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments down below. I know that this is a little different from the content I usually make on the channel here, but life is all about growth, and I am so passionate about Indiana Jones toys that this was really fun to make, and I can't wait to make more reviews as time goes by. So if you're new here, be sure to hit like and subscribe. I'll catch you guys on the next video, and until next time, build on. Well, you made it to the end of the video. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and maybe check out one of my other videos listed here.